Good evening and welcome. Settle into a comfortable place, let your shoulders soften, and allow the small concerns of today to drift quietly into the background. Tonight, we are not chasing great battles or famous victories. Instead, we are stepping into a much stranger mystery, one hidden not inside castles or treasure chests, but inside the ordinary lives of people who loved, married, argued, hoped, and quietly grew old nearly 800 years ago. As your breathing becomes slow and steady, imagine the sound of distant church bells carried across rolling fields, the scent of damp earth after gentle rain, and the warm glow of a hearth flickering against rough stone walls. Somewhere in that peaceful village, two people are about to begin a marriage that, despite everything history often tells us, may have had very little to do with romance at all. One of the greatest surprises waiting inside the Middle Ages is that medieval marriage was rarely designed to answer the question, who do you love? It was far more likely to answer the question, who owns which field? This sounds wonderfully unromantic, and in many cases it absolutely was. Modern people often imagine history as an endless parade of passionate knights serenading noble ladies beneath moonlit balconies. Medieval account books, meanwhile, had a remarkable tendency to interrupt these fantasies by discussing sheep, grain taxes, property boundaries, and exactly how many silver coins should accompany a daughter into her new household. The human heart, as it turned out, was expected to wait politely while everyone else discussed economics. Imagine yourself waking before sunrise in a small English village during the 13th century. The room is cold enough that climbing out from beneath your wool blanket feels like negotiating a peace treaty with winter itself. Your bed is little more than a straw mattress resting upon wooden board. It makes soft rustling sounds every time someone shifts their weight, and if you are fortunate, the straw has been replaced recently enough that it still smells faintly sweet instead of carrying the unmistakable fragrance of several previous seasons. Outside, the village is already stretching awake. A rooster announces his achievements with enormous confidence, despite having accomplished little more than surviving another evening. Smoke rises lazily from chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of burning oak mixed with yesterday's cooking. The roads are muddy, the air is cool, and nearly every family is already thinking about work long before breakfast has earned the right to call itself breakfast. For a young boy, childhood is surprisingly short. By the age of 7 or 8, he is already learning how to guide oxen through heavy soil, repair fences, collect firewood, and carry water without spilling too much of it onto his boots. His hands become rough years before adulthood officially arrives, and his understanding of responsibility grows faster than his height. A young girl experiences a similar rhythm. She helps grind grain into flour using heavy stone mills that seem determined to remind everyone that bread requires astonishing patience. She gathers herbs from nearby fields, feeds chickens who display an almost artistic talent for escaping fences, spins wool into thread, and learns to prepare meals over smoky fires that leave every piece of clothing carrying the permanent perfume of camel wood smoke. Romantic poetry rarely pauses to mention that most love stories began while someone smelled strongly of onions. The daily routine itself quietly shaped relationships long before anyone considered marriage. Boys and girls often knew each other from early childhood because villages were small communities where nearly every face became familiar. They carried water from the same wells, attended the same church services, celebrated the same harvest festivals, and occasionally endured the same lectures from elderly neighbors who believed young people had been making poor decisions continuously. Since the beginning of civilization, curiously, every generation has believed that the next generation is becoming hopelessly irresponsible. It may be one of history's most consistent traditions. As children became teenagers, subtle changes appeared almost unnoticed. A boy who once raced through muddy fields now found himself attempting, with mixed success, to appear respectable whenever certain young women happened to be nearby. A girl who had spent years carrying baskets without concern suddenly became aware that someone else might be watching. Neither of them possessed mirrors large enough to admire themselves dramatically, which perhaps spared medieval Europe an extraordinary amount of unnecessary posing. Instead, impressions were made through work. Reliability mattered. Patience mattered. Could someone harvest a field before rain arrived? Would they care for aging parents? Could they repair a leaking roof before winter transformed a smaller inconvenience into a catastrophic indoor weather system? These questions carried remarkable importance because marriage was not simply a private relationship between two individuals. It was the foundation of an entire household economy. Today, people sometimes joke that marriage means combining streaming subscriptions and deciding whose turn it is to wash the dishes. Medieval couples were combining survival strategies. A poor harvest affected both partners. A sick cow affected both partners. A broken cartwheel affected everyone. Love, if it appeared, had to squeeze itself into a schedule already crowded with chores. That reality has encouraged many people to assume medieval marriages were entirely cold arrangements without affection. Yet surviving letters, court records, household accounts, and religious writings quietly suggest something far more complicated. Love certainly existed. It simply occupied different spaces. Rather than endless declarations beneath balconies, affection often revealed itself through remarkably ordinary acts. A husband repairing his wife's favorite stool before winter. A wife saving the largest portion of bread for her exhausted husband after harvest. Parents quietly staying awake beside an ill child throughout the night while the fire slowly faded into glowing embers. None of these moments would inspire wandering troubadours to compose spectacular ballads. Yet together, they formed the quiet architecture of everyday devotion. Modern audiences often underestimate just how physically demanding ordinary existence truly was. Every loaf of bread represented hours of grinding grain by hand. Every clean shirt represented washing, drying, beating, mending, and spinning fibers into new cloth whenever the old one surrendered to exhaustion. Every warm meal depended on gathering fuel before darkness arrived. There was no convenient switch waiting patiently upon a wall. Endless wood. History occasionally resembles an exceptionally long conversation between humanity and firewood. If one partner became injured, the consequences spread through the household with frightening speed. Crops waited for no one. Animals refused to suspend their feeding schedules out of sympathy. Rain displayed no interest whatsoever in human misfortune. This practical partnership explains why parents often played such influential roles in choosing spouses. From a modern perspective, arranged marriages can appear astonishingly unfair. Surely no one else should decide something so deeply personal. Yet medieval families lived inside an economic world where individual decisions affected entire generations. Land was precious, inheritance was complicated, dowries represented financial security. A carefully arranged marriage could prevent disputes over property, strengthen alliances between neighboring families, or rescue struggling households from poverty. Romance, unfortunately, occupied a position somewhere below healthy livestock, and slightly above remembering where someone had left the shovel. That may sound terribly cynical, but people themselves were not necessarily cynical. Many genuinely believed they were acting lovingly. Parents often arranged marriages because they hoped stability would produce happiness. They measured success differently than modern societies often do. Instead of asking whether two young people felt overwhelming emotional excitement, they wondered whether the future household would remain fed during difficult winters. Security first, passion, if possible, later. Surprisingly, this approach sometimes worked better than outsiders expect. Medieval literature frequently celebrates sudden romance, yet real life unfolded over decades rather than dramatic afternoons. Two strangers brought together by family negotiations might slowly discover shared habits, mutual respect, private jokes, and quiet companionship while raising children, harvesting crops, or surviving yet another stubborn winter. Affection did not always arrive before marriage. Sometimes it quietly unpacked its belongings afterward. Of course, not every story developed so peacefully. Some marriages remained distant. Others became deeply unhappy. Human personalities have never shown much interest in following carefully designed plans, and no legal agreement has ever possessed the magical ability to transform incompatible people into devoted companions. History, despite its impressive collection of official documents, continually loses arguments against ordinary human emotion. And nowhere would that become more obvious than when young people discovered that the heart possessed an astonishing talent for ignoring every carefully negotiated arrangement their parents had spent months constructing. That quiet rebellion of the heart was, perhaps, one of the least surprising and yet most inconvenient features of medieval society. Parents could negotiate land, priests could bless unions, lawyers could draft agreements, and noble families could spend months discussing inheritance, but none of them ever discovered a reliable method for persuading human affection to arrive precisely on schedule. History is filled with ambitious people who believed they could organize everything. The weather disagreed, disease disagreed, and, rather persistently, love disagreed as well. For ordinary villagers, however, there was often a little more freedom than modern imagination gives them credit for. Contrary to the popular image that every medieval marriage was arranged by stern fathers pointing dramatically across the room, many peasant couples actually had considerable influence over whom they married. This was not because society had suddenly embraced romantic individualism. It was because poor families possessed fewer estates, castles, vineyards, or political alliances to negotiate. When there is no vast fortune at stake, parents tend to become noticeably more flexible. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the wealthiest families often had the fewest choices. A duke's daughter might inherit magnificent halls, jeweled gowns, and enough servants to misplace an entire banquet without anyone noticing immediately. Yet she might also discover that nearly every important decision about her future had already been discussed by men sitting around a long wooden table while she was still learning to read. Meanwhile, a farmer's daughter, whose family owned little more than a modest cottage, several chickens, and a pig with unusually ambitious escape plans, sometimes enjoyed a greater chance of marrying someone she genuinely liked. Apparently, freedom occasionally arrives wearing patched wool instead of silk. Among the nobility, marriage resembled an elaborate diplomatic negotiation disguised as a family celebration. Every detail carried meaning. The amount of land included in the dowry mattered. The promises surrounding future inheritance mattered. The number of witnesses mattered. Even the timing could become a carefully calculated decision, chosen to strengthen political relationships or secure peace between rival families. One almost expects someone to interrupt these negotiations by quietly asking whether the bride and groom had actually met. Sometimes they had. Sometimes they had not. Neither answer necessarily changed the outcome. This does not mean medieval noblemen and noblewomen lacked emotions. Quite the opposite. They laughed, worried, dreamed, grieved, and fell hopelessly in love, just as people do today. The tragedy was not an absence of feeling. The tragedy was not an absence of feeling. It was the remarkable number of practical obstacles standing politely between those feelings and any possibility of acting upon them. The dowry itself deserves closer attention because it has accumulated an unfortunate reputation in modern conversation. It is often imagined as little more than a price placed upon a bride. But medieval reality was considerably more complicated. A dowry usually consisted of property, money, livestock, textiles, household goods, or land contributed by the bride's family to help establish the new household. In many regions, it also functioned as financial protection for the wife. Should she become widowed, portions of that property might help secure her future. It was, in a curious way, both an economic calculation and a form of insurance. History has an extraordinary talent for placing kindness and commerce inside the same wooden chest. A prosperous family might provide beautifully woven linen, silver cups, carved furniture, cattle, or parcels of fertile farmland. Less wealthy families offered whatever they realistically could. Sometimes it was a modest chest filled with blankets, cooking pots, spinning tools, and enough supplies to begin married life with dignity. These objects were practical, but they also carried emotional weight. A woven blanket represented countless hours spent at the loom. A carved chest might have been built by the bride's father. Simple household tools quietly connected one generation to the next. Long before wedding photographs existed, these possessions became family memories. Curiously, medieval people often invested enormous effort into objects that modern households would replace without much thought. A wooden table might serve several generations. A cooking pot could become an inheritance. A carefully made wool blanket might warm grandchildren who had never met the woman who first spun its thread. There is something deeply comforting about a world where everyday objects were expected to grow old alongside the families who used them. Eventually, after negotiations, agreements, blessings, and enough discussions to satisfy even the most enthusiastic medieval lawyer, The wedding day finally arrived. Despite everything we have said about practical arrangements, medieval weddings were far from joyless affairs. Quite the opposite. For many villages, a wedding represented one of the largest celebrations anyone would experience all year. Church bells echoed across the countryside. Neighbors gathered in their finest clothing, which often meant garments that were only slightly less patched than their ordinary ones. Children ran excitedly through the village with the remarkable ability to transform any formal occasion into organized chaos within minutes. Musicians tuned fiddles, flutes, and simple pipes. Someone was almost certainly worrying about whether enough bread had been baked. Someone else was worrying about whether too much ale had been prepared. History strongly suggests that people have worried about refreshments at celebrations for an exceptionally long time. Marriage was increasingly understood not simply as a private agreement, but as a sacred commitment witnessed before God and the community. This represented an enormous shift. Earlier medieval customs sometimes emphasized family negotiations more than church ritual. But by the High Middle Ages, the church had steadily expanded its influence over marriage, insisting that the union carried profound spiritual significance. Love, property, religion, inheritance, and public reputation now found themselves attending the same ceremony. It made for an extraordinarily crowded institution. The vows themselves were often simple. Simple words, enormous consequences. Unlike modern weddings, where months of preparation frequently culminate in a reception documented from approximately 17 different camera angles, medieval ceremonies relied upon memory. The people present became the record. Witnesses mattered because they could later confirm that the marriage had truly taken place. There were no marriage certificates tucked neatly inside filing cabinets. There was only community. If everyone remembered seeing the vows exchanged, then the marriage existed. Human memory served as official paperwork, a wonderfully economical system, provided no one forgot anything important. After the ceremony came the feast. Now the village truly relaxed. Bread filled long wooden tables. Roasted meats appeared, if the family could afford them. Cheese, onions, beans, pies, fresh herbs, apples, nuts, and generous quantities of ale circulated freely among smiling guests. Stories became slightly more dramatic with every passing cup. Songs grew louder. Dancing continued well into the evening. Older relatives offered advice to the newlyweds that had almost certainly been offered at every wedding for centuries. Some advice proved genuinely wise. Some probably should have remained unspoken. Every family appears to possess at least one relative whose confidence exceeds the usefulness of their recommendations. That tradition, reassuringly, also appears timeless. Among wealthier nobles, wedding feasts expanded into dazzling demonstrations of status. Exotic spices, elaborate decorations, imported wines, musicians, entertainers, and multiple courses displayed not only generosity, but wealth itself. The meal became political theater. Guests admired prosperity while quietly calculating exactly how prosperous the hosts truly were. One suspects medieval banquets contained nearly as much silent financial analysis as conversation. Yet, beneath all this ceremony lay a rather touching truth. Regardless of wealth, every newly married couple faced exactly the same morning afterward. The guests departed. The music faded. The candles burned low. Real life quietly knocked on the door. And real life, unlike wedding celebrations, had very little interest in dramatic entrances. It arrived carrying laundry, muddy boots, hungry animals, leaking roofs, crying infants, aging parents, unpaid rents, and fields that continued growing weeds regardless of anyone's marital happiness. Marriage, it turned out, was not sustained by one extraordinary day. It was built by thousands of astonishingly ordinary ones. That quiet realization would become the true test of every medieval husband and wife. And it would also reveal why some couples slowly discovered deep companionship, while others found themselves carrying secret longings that no wedding feast, no family agreement, and no solemn vow could ever completely silence. The first morning of married life was almost always quieter than the celebration that had welcomed it. The musicians had packed away their instruments, the last guests had wandered home with cheerful promises to visit again, and the long tables that had groaned beneath loaves of bread and roasted meat were now little more than scattered crumbs waiting for curious chickens. Marriage, despite its grand entrance, settled into everyday life with remarkable speed. The husband rose before dawn, because fields had very little respect for romance. Wheat continued growing whether newlyweds wished to admire each other's company or not. A broken fence still needed repairing. Oxen still expected feeding with the unwavering confidence of creatures entirely unconcerned with human emotions. His wife was already awake, coaxing yesterday's embers back into life beneath the cooking pot. The familiar scent of smoke slowly filled the cottage, followed by barley porridge and coarse bread warming beside the fire. If anyone expected marriage to transform ordinary mornings into endless scenes of poetic affection, medieval reality offered a gentle correction. Love usually arrived carrying a bucket. One of the most fascinating truths about medieval married life is that husband and wife functioned less like two independent people sharing a home and more like business partners running a remarkably demanding family enterprise. The household itself was an economic machine, and every member contributed. The husband generally performed the heavier agricultural labor. He plowed fields, repaired buildings, cared for horses or oxen, chopped timber, negotiated rents with landlords, and represented the household in many legal matters. These responsibilities required physical endurance more than elegance, which perhaps explains why medieval fashion never fully embraced pristine white clothing for farmers. Mud, after all, possessed an extraordinary ability to ignore social expectations. Meanwhile, the wife's responsibilities stretched far beyond cooking and cleaning, despite centuries of simplified storytelling suggesting otherwise. She supervised food preparation, baked bread, brewed ale, spun wool into thread, wove cloth, tended vegetable gardens, milked cows, raised poultry, preserved food for winter, managed household supplies, and often handled small-scale trading within the village. In many homes, she also kept track of stored grain, salted meat, dried herbs, candles, firewood, and countless practical details that quietly determined whether the family would survive until spring. Modern companies might call this logistics management. The Middle Ages simply called it Tuesday. Historians sometimes smile when modern people describe medieval women as having stayed at home, because home itself was one of the busiest workplaces imaginable. A cottage was not merely a place for sleeping. It functioned simultaneously as a bakery, brewery, textile workshop, storage warehouse, nursery, medical clinic, and occasionally an emergency shelter for confused livestock seeking warmth during particularly unpleasant weather. Work rarely stopped. Even winter, often imagined as a peaceful season of rest, simply exchanged one collection of tasks for another. Clothing required constant repair. Tools demanded maintenance. Wool needed spinning. Children soon became part of this rhythm. Medieval families were generally large, though not always by deliberate choice. Infant mortality remained painfully high, disease visited without invitation, and many parents quietly understood that not every child born into the household would live to adulthood. It is one of history's gentlest tragedies that medieval parents often loved deeply while living with constant uncertainty. Perhaps this explains why surviving letters, prayers, and religious writings frequently reveal extraordinary tenderness toward children. Contrary to an old misconception, medieval mothers and fathers were not emotionally distant simply because life was difficult. Difficulty often strengthens affection rather than diminishing it. A father might carve tiny wooden toys during the evening, after hours spent harvesting grain beneath the summer sun. A mother might quietly remain awake throughout the night beside a feverish child, while the rest of the household slept. These moments rarely appeared in official chronicles, because kings attracted more attention than ordinary parents. History has always possessed a slight celebrity problem. The education of children happened naturally through observation. Sons watched fathers sharpen scythes, mend carts, and negotiate agreements with neighbors. Daughters learned spinning, baking, gardening, and household management from mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and older sisters. Knowledge traveled through hands long before it traveled through books. One generation simply watched another. Meals reflected this practical existence. They were filling rather than glamorous. Thick stews simmered slowly above the fire. Bread appeared almost daily. Cheese, onions, beans, cabbage, peas, oats, and seasonal vegetables formed the foundation of countless dinners. Meat remained less common for ordinary villagers than popular imagination sometimes suggests. Curiously, Medieval cooks possessed an impressive ability to transform remarkably similar ingredients into meals that somehow felt different enough to avoid complete despair. One develops considerable culinary creativity when the pantry insists upon cabbage for the fourth consecutive day. The evenings unfolded with equal simplicity. As daylight faded, candlelight and firelight became the only companions against gathering darkness. Families repaired clothing, told stories, prayed together, or listened while older relatives recounted events that had somehow become slightly more heroic with each passing decade. Human memory possesses an extraordinary talent for improving personal achievements. By the time grandfather reached his 70s, the fish had grown considerably larger than when he first caught it. Marriage itself slowly changed through these routines. Affection matured. Not every day was joyful. Arguments certainly happened. People disagreed over money, responsibilities, stubborn relatives, wandering animals, forgotten promises, and all the wonderfully ordinary frustrations that continue to accompany family life centuries later. There is something strangely comforting about realizing that husbands have been forgetting important errands for an astonishingly long time. Yet medieval society also imposed clear expectations. The husband was generally recognized as head of the household in legal and religious terms. But practical authority, some medieval moral writers enthusiastically described ideal family hierarchies. Actual married couples frequently negotiated something considerably more flexible. Reality has always displayed a charming resistance toward perfect theory. Of course, not every marriage became a partnership built upon mutual respect. Some husbands proved cruel. Some wives were deeply unhappy. Alcohol, financial hardship, illness, and personal conflict complicated countless households. Medieval courts contain records of domestic disputes, abandoned spouses, arguments over property, and accusations that remind us human imperfection requires remarkably little historical encouragement. The Middle Ages were populated by people, not idealized storybook characters, and wherever people gather, complicated emotions quietly follow. Perhaps nowhere did those emotions become more complicated than in matters of forbidden love, because despite every sermon preached from the pulpit, every marriage negotiated between respectable families, and every public vow exchanged before the altar, the human heart retained its ancient habit of wandering beyond carefully constructed boundaries. A noblewoman might discover herself captivated by a gifted musician whose songs possessed more honesty than the carefully rehearsed compliments of wealthy suitors. A merchant's son might fall deeply in love with a servant whose kindness far exceeded her social standing. A young monk, having promised his life to prayer, might suddenly realize that vows made in youth had not silenced entirely human desires. An unhappy wife might find unexpected comfort in the gentle attention of someone outside her marriage. None of these stories began with scandal. Almost all began with conversation, with shared laughter, with familiar glances across busy marketplaces, with two people discovering that understanding another soul can happen long before anyone intends for it to happen. And that quiet beginning was precisely what made forbidden love so unsettling to medieval society, because once affection had quietly taken root, neither family honor, social class, nor even the authority of the church could guarantee that it just would simply disappear. That was the uncomfortable truth medieval society spent centuries trying to manage. Rules could shape behavior, customs could encourage obedience, families could arrange marriages with extraordinary care, and priests could deliver sermons reminding everyone of their duties. Yet none of these institutions ever discovered a reliable cure for inconvenient affection. Human beings continued to fall in love with astonishing determination, often at precisely the wrong time, with precisely the wrong person, in ways that caused generations of respectable relatives to sigh deeply into their cups of ale. One of the more fascinating misconceptions about forbidden love in the Middle Ages is the belief that it belonged exclusively to castles and royal courts. Novels and films adore noble scandals because velvet cloaks photograph much better than muddy boots. In reality, secret romances unfolded just as frequently in villages, market towns, monasteries, and workshops. Ordinary people possessed ordinary hearts, which unfortunately proved just as difficult to supervise as aristocratic ones. The difference was that ordinary scandals rarely became famous. History has always favored people wearing crowns over people carrying cabbage. Imagine a village market on a cool autumn morning. Farmers arrive with baskets of apples still carrying droplets of dew. Bakers arrange coarse loaves upon wooden tables. Chickens wander freely, convinced they are responsible for inspecting every transaction. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer strikes glowing iron with patient rhythm, while children weave between adults with the remarkable confidence that everyone else will avoid stepping on them. Markets were not merely places to exchange goods, they were information networks, friendship networks, courtship networks, the medieval equivalent of social media, except people generally remembered each other's faces instead of profile pictures, and unkind comments required the considerably greater courage of being spoken aloud. Young men and women met naturally in these busy public spaces. They exchanged greetings, small jokes, perhaps a little harmless teasing over the quality of someone's vegetables. The answer is wonderfully complicated. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes everyone involved understood that the performance itself carried social value. Human beings have always possessed an extraordinary talent for confusing sincere emotion with elaborate theatre. The church viewed many of these developments with understandable concern. Romantic poetry, if left entirely unsupervised, occasionally encouraged people to prioritize personal desire above religious duty or marital commitment. Priests reminded congregations that love should strengthen virtue rather than undermine it. Congregations listened politely. Human nature continued making independent decisions. One particularly unusual challenge involved marriages across different social classes. Medieval society was built upon hierarchy. Nobles married nobles. Merchants preferred merchant families. Craftsmen often married within their own communities. Peasants generally remained among peasants. This arrangement created predictability. It also created frustration. Suppose a noblewoman genuinely admired a talented village musician whose songs filled great halls with quiet wonder. He possessed intelligence, kindness, and character, but unfortunately lacked one small detail considered rather important by her family: several thousand acres of inherited land. Her parents might admire his musical ability, while simultaneously calculating exactly how little it contributed to military alliances or property negotiations. Romantic compatibility, unfortunately, ranked lower than strategic geography. Likewise, a prosperous merchant's daughter who fell in love with an apprentice possessing little wealth might discover that affection alone did not impress parents who had spent decades building successful businesses. Marriage, from their perspective, represented continuity, stability, and carefully accumulated prosperity. Love was welcome, provided it completed the correct paperwork. Yet perhaps the most quietly remarkable forbidden romances involved members of the clergy. Medieval priests in the Western Church were increasingly expected to remain celibate, a discipline strengthened over several centuries. In theory, the rule appeared clear. Reality, as always, displayed considerably more imagination. Court records, letters, complaints, and church documents reveal that some priests formed emotional attachments despite official expectations. Some maintained secret relationships. Others quietly lived with women who were politely described using wonderfully creative language that convinced almost no one. Entire villages occasionally knew exactly what was happening while maintaining the collective courtesy of pretending not to notice. Communities can be surprisingly diplomatic when everyone benefits from avoiding awkward conversations. Church authorities periodically attempted reforms, issuing renewed reminders about clerical discipline. Some reforms proved effective, others demonstrated yet again that rules written neat. Everyone carried convictions. Everyone carried contradictions. History becomes far more interesting once we stop expecting perfect consistency. Even accusations of adultery reveal surprising complexity. Medieval law and religious teaching certainly condemned extramarital relationships, but communities often responded differently depending upon status, local custom, evidence, and circumstance. Some offenders faced public penance, others paid fines. Noble scandals might trigger political consequences reaching far beyond marriage itself. Public reputation mattered enormously. Honor could be damaged almost as quickly as trust, and yet gossip itself became one of medieval Europe's most efficient institutions. Entire villages functioned as remarkably sophisticated information systems, despite lacking newspapers. Someone always knew. Someone always told someone else. Before long, everyone possessed an opinion. one begins to suspect that gossip requires neither electricity nor the internet to flourish successfully. It merely requires people. As generations passed, countless romances bloomed, faded, survived, or disappeared without leaving written record. Historians recover fragments. A court case here, a surviving letter there, a legal dispute over inheritance, an unexpected poem hidden inside an old manuscript. These scattered voices remind us that beneath the official structures of medieval marriage lay millions of individual lives. Lives filled with compromise, with quiet affection, with disappointment, with laughter, with sacrifice, with moments of extraordinary tenderness that no chronicler considered important enough to record. And perhaps those forgotten moments mattered more than all the royal weddings history remembers, because while noble families negotiated alliances and priests debated doctrine, ordinary couples continued building homes, raising children, comforting one another through illness and winter, and discovering that the deepest form of love was often neither dramatic nor forbidden. It was simply the quiet decision, made again and again across thousands of ordinary evenings, to remain beside another person as the fire slowly settled into glowing embers and another medieval day gently came to its end. Over the centuries, those cottages disappeared, the voices fell silent, the wedding feasts ended, and even the greatest family names slowly faded into weathered stone. Yet the questions those people asked about love, duty, faith, and happiness never truly vanished. They simply waited patiently for us to ask them again. And perhaps that is the quiet destination toward which our journey has been moving all along. If you were to wander through Europe today, long after those medieval weddings have faded into memory, you would still find small stone churches resting beside ancient fields. Their walls have absorbed centuries of whispered vows, joyful laughter, quiet tears, nervous promises, and final farewells. Moss now softens the edges of weathered gravestones. Ivy climbs towers that once watched over entire villages. The bells still ring from time to time, though few of the names they once celebrated remain familiar to anyone living. The remarkable thing is not that these people disappeared. The remarkable thing is how familiar they remain. The young farmer wondering whether the girl across the village might return his smile would understand the uncertainty of modern romance perfectly well. The noblewoman caught between duty and affection would recognize the feeling of choosing between expectation and desire. Parents hoping their children might enjoy a safer, happier future would find little unfamiliar in our own century. 700 years have transformed almost everything around love, and almost nothing within it. Today, very few families negotiate marriages over parcels of farmland, political alliances, or carefully counted sheep. Dowries have largely faded into history across much of the world. Most people choose their own partners with a freedom that would have astonished many medieval villagers. The law in many countries recognizes equality between husbands and wives in ways unimaginable to countless generations before us. Divorce, once nearly impossible under medieval Christian doctrine, has become a legal reality in many societies. Marrying across social classes no longer threatens entire dynasties, and few parents spend years negotiating inheritance contracts before allowing two young people to share a dance. History, at least in this respect, has traveled a very long road. Yet beneath these enormous changes, the human heart continues behaving with its wonderfully stubborn consistency. People still wonder whether they are loved enough. They still hesitate before speaking difficult words. They still write messages they later regret sending. They still lose sleep over uncertain futures. They still hope that another person might understand them completely, despite the curious fact that most of us struggle to understand ourselves before breakfast. Human nature has always possessed an endearing confidence. Perhaps that is why medieval love stories continue speaking to us so gently. They remind us that behind every historical label, peasant, knight, merchant, abbess, queen, blacksmith, monk, princess, shepherd, stood someone whose inner world looked remarkably similar to our own. Someone who laughed at familiar jokes, someone who worried about tomorrow's work, someone who carried quiet dreams that never appeared in official records. History often introduces us to kings. Sleep stories introduce us to everyone else. There is something comforting about imagining an ordinary medieval evening settling over a quiet village. Smoke rises lazily from cottage chimneys into the cool twilight. A husband returns home, carrying worn tools, polished smooth by years of honest work. His wife finishes kneading tomorrow's bread, while children slowly drift towards sleep beneath thick wool blankets. Somewhere in the distance, a shepherd whistles softly as sheep settle for the night. The last voices fade from the village path, and only the steady crackle of the hearth remains. No one inside that little cottage imagines they are becoming history. They are simply living. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The people who spend their lives trying hardest to become immortal are often remembered only through statues whose inscriptions slowly fade beneath rain and wind. Meanwhile, countless ordinary husbands and wives whose names have vanished completely left behind something much more enduring. They left behind the quiet pattern of everyday human love. Not perfect love, not effortless love, not the kind celebrated endlessly by poets or painted onto cathedral ceilings, but the quieter version built from shared work, patient forgiveness, familiar routines, small sacrifices, warm meals, tired smiles across wooden tables, and the comforting certainty that someone else would still be there when another difficult winter finally gave way to spring. Even the church, which spent centuries attempting to define every rule surrounding marriage, eventually became part of a much larger story. Its stone monasteries remain. Its magnificent cathedrals still reach toward the sky. Ancient manuscripts survive within silent libraries. Yet the debates that once seemed capable of shaping all of Europe now rest peacefully beside countless other chapters of history. Time has a remarkably democratic way of treating every certainty. Kings, popes, farmers, lovers, scholars, children, eventually all become quiet neighbors beneath the same patient sky. The castles have softened into ruins. The villages have changed. The old wedding songs have disappeared into silence. The gossip that once felt desperately important has dissolved into air. Arguments over dowries, inheritance, forbidden affection, family honor, and social status have become little more than gentle echoes carried through empty cloisters and forgotten churchyards, where only birds seem interested in continuing the conversation. The evening breeze moves through ancient stone arches with perfect indifference to every victory and every disappointment that once unfolded beneath them. Perhaps that is not a sad thought. Perhaps it is one of history's greatest comforts. Because if even the grandest ambitions eventually become quiet whispers, then so do our worries. What remains is something far simpler. The warmth shared between two people. The kindness offered without expectation. The courage to care for another human being despite uncertainty. Those things travel across centuries far more gracefully than crowns, castles, or legal contracts ever could. So as this quiet journey through medieval love gently comes to its end, you can leave behind the arranged marriages, the wedding feasts, the secret romances, the family negotiations, the church bells, the bustling marketplaces, and the countless lives that slowly drifted through those distant centuries. They have returned to where all history eventually rests, not forgotten, simply peaceful. And perhaps now, as your own thoughts grow slower and softer, you can let those ancient villages fade into the evening mist, where warm firelight glows faintly through small cottage windows, where distant bells mark another day gently passing in memory, and where the countless love stories of ordinary people continue only as whispers carried softly upon the night air. Thank you for spending this quiet evening wandering through the gentle, complicated, and surprisingly familiar world of medieval love. Now, there is nothing more you need to solve, nothing more you need to remember, and nowhere else you need to be. And let sleep find you as gently as history itself.